around, make sure you see what's going on, and then when the lights go down, just focus on the square, this cross in the middle. Just focus on that and keep focusing on it, and don't take your eyes off it.
So I'm just going to leave that on the screen for a little bit now. So consciousness, I think, is about the most interesting thing that we can study in science these days. But anybody who's interested in consciousness is faced with the immediate problem of how do we define consciousness? And there are some people who think that maybe we actually have to have a very precise definition of consciousness that everybody agrees on before we can make any progress. But I happen to disagree with that. I think that actually we can make progress without having a very precise definition to begin with, that definitions sometimes follow the fundamental insights in explaining something and don't have to precede them. But I've got to say something about what I think consciousness is, and hopefully it's something we can all agree on a little bit. Consciousness is any kind of subjective experience, the experience of eating a banana, the experience of reading a book, the experience of being a self, and the experience of hearing my voice. These are all instances of consciousness. Consciousness is the appearance of a world. For each of us, consciousness is what fades when you fall into a dreamless sleep at night, and it's what returns in the morning when you wake up. And for each of us, consciousness is literally all there is. Without consciousness, there is nothing at all, no world, no self. Consciousness is what makes life worth living and maybe sometimes worth leaving. This is why consciousness is really the most important and interesting problem we can study. Freud recognized this. Freud, in the early 20th century, noted that there were three, what he called strikes against the centrality of humanity. And the first was Copernicus's work, which showed that, in fact, we weren't at the center of the universe. And then came Darwin, who showed that we weren't apart from the other animals in the animal kingdom, were all related. And for Freud, the third strike against humanity would have been an explanation of our conscious selves, that which makes us human. And as we progressively naturalize these things, we become more part of the world and less apart from the world. So hopefully you've been experiencing something rather strange here. This is a visual illusion called the lilac chaser illusion, which was developed by a guy called Jeremy Hinton some years ago now. So all that is going on, as Alok said, is there are some magenta circles which occasionally disappear. And if you've been focusing on the the black cross in the middle, then maybe what you will have seen is that gradually the magenta circles, they turn into a green circle that chases around and starts gobbling up all the magenta circles. Did people see that? Yeah? And if you stare at it long enough, then maybe all the magenta circles disappear, and all you see is a single green circle whizzing around. Did everybody see that? That's great. Always a worry whether these things work in different kinds of halls, but it's a Royal Institution, so I'm sure it will. I wanted to show this because I think it's a very powerful example of a subjective conscious experience and how it's something that the brain is generating, constructing, that in this case is quite indirectly related to what's going on actually in the world. And this gives us a way in as scientists to try to understand what the underlying neural mechanisms are. And really that's what I want to emphasize over the course of this debate, how far we've already come in understanding the biological basis of consciousness. Over the last few decades, thanks to advances in brain imaging technology and a revitalized attitude throughout psychology and neuroscience, I think real progress has been made in understanding what the brain mechanisms is. The brain. I mean, at one point in time, people were thinking consciousness might be more to do with the heart or other parts of the body, but what the relevant brain mechanisms are for consciousness. And I wrote about some of these in this article in The Guardian last week, but highlighting what I call 8 key questions for consciousness science. And some of these are questions where progress has already been made. So, for example, we know quite a lot now about what some of the critical brain mechanisms are for consciousness. We know that the cerebellum, the big lump at the back, which actually contains more than half the neurons in the brain, is not so necessary for consciousness. You can get rid of that, and your conscious experiences will be not so greatly affected. We know quite a bit about what happens when people undergo general anesthesia in the brain, why that leads to a total loss of consciousness. We can even begin to unravel some of the processes underlying what it feels like to have an experience of wanting to do something, a sort of experience of volition and will. And some of these findings are having impacts now in the clinic and in hospitals as we begin to be able to do better diagnosis and treatment and prognosis for people having suffered severe brain injury, and as we'll hear probably from Chris, in psychiatric conditions like schizophrenia, where he's done fundamental work. But as these scientific findings accumulate, we confront the hard problem, which is the theme of this debate. And the hard problem actually has, it's coined by David Chalmers in the 90s, but of course has a much longer history going back to Descartes and Plato. And it's really the idea that even if we understood all the physical workings of the brain, how behavior is generated, everything that's going on so that the brain does what it does, there's still some fundamental mystery about why there should be anything like subjective experience attached to that. Tom Nagel put it a different way as the explanatory gap. And so this is really why consciousness seems so resistant, seems so tricky to explanation. And there are a few responses, and what I want to just offer for discussion later on is why should we be so worried about the hard problem? Often the hard problem is motivated by the idea that we kind of got an idea what it would be like to have a complete description of the brain at all levels of detail. But we don't. We don't really know. Despite the progress that we're making, we don't really know what it would be like to know how the brain does everything that it does. And that's why the science of it's so exciting, because we're beginning to develop new concepts to describe how the brain does what it does. So it may be that once we've got these new concepts, the hard problem doesn't seem quite so hard. Another reason for optimism is looking back at the history of science and something like vitalism. At one point in time, it seemed that the mystery of why animate things, or living things, were distinct from non-living things may be resistant also to scientific explanation. Some essence vitale, élan vital might be necessary. And we don't tend to think that way anymore with the development of new concepts. Light, connecting light to vibrations as well, kind of mysterious before we develop the right concepts. And of course, even if the hard problem remains a mystery, there's the pragmatic attitude, which is, well, what do? You know, let's say it's still mysterious why consciousness exists in the universe. We know it does, and we're beginning to realize that it depends on specific parts of the brain. So why don't we just go ahead and study those things? So I want to finish with just by raising a couple of issues that maybe we can discuss later. One is, why do people think consciousness is so hard to study? There always seems to be quite a furore about people claiming to have made progress in studying science, studying consciousness scientifically. The second challenge, and it's related, is what would count as a good explanation? So we talk about whether it's possible or not possible to scientifically explain consciousness, but I think it's very difficult to do that in the absence of having a good idea of what would be satisfactory to us. And the third challenge, which is actually a lead-on to Professor Smith, who's going to follow me in a second, is the role of philosophy in this issue. So my colleague Christoph Koch from Caltech said very provocatively at one point, probably partly in jest, that philosophers have been wrong about every single issue under the sun over the last 2,000 years, and that while we should listen very carefully to the questions philosophers ask, we should never listen to their answers to these questions. So with that, I'll let Barry take over.